The sharpness of your lens depends on the aperture that it's set to, and we need to know which the sharpest aperture is to get the sharpest images when we want them. And different lenses will have different characteristics, so you'll have to run this test for every lens that you use. And I use this 85mm lens 85% of the time, so it's a good one for me to start with. You might not always be able to shoot at the optimum aperture, but it's good to know what you're missing out on if you shoot wide open or stopped fully down. Just like with ISO and noise, there's likely an absolute sharpest aperture, but there's also a range of acceptable sharpness that depends on your own needs and opinions. This test needs a little attention to the setup because we need to be perfectly focused on a flat plane. The camera's on a copy stand, though you could use a tripod for this, and I'm using a bubble level to make sure that the camera and the flat paper I'm taking a picture of are in the same plane. The target is a print of fine lines so that we can judge the sharpness of those lines at different f-stops. I'll be taking a set of pictures where the focus is in the center of the target and another set with the focus point near one of the corners to see how the center of the lens differs from the periphery. For portraits, soft corners aren't really a problem. In fact, I'd say that they look better that way. However, for tasks like digitizing flat negatives and for brick wall photographers, corner sharpness is critical. For this test, we'll be keeping the ISO fixed so we don't confuse differences of noise level with sharpness. We'll be varying the aperture from fully wide open to fully closed down, and in this case, that's from f1.2 to f16. And I'll jump from f1.2 to f1.4 so that we can stick to full stop values. Just like the ISO versus noise test, we'll be keeping the exposure constant using the shutter speed to compensate. We're on a copy stand, so camera shake shouldn't be a problem. I'm also using a remote rather than physically pressing the shutter button, and that will further reduce the amount of shake that's possible. I've uploaded all of the test pictures into Lightroom, and out of all of the apertures available on my lens, I'm sure that one is the sharpest, but there's a range where I can't tell the difference in sharpness between one aperture and another. I'm gonna zoom in somewhere in the middle of the scale to see what the sharpness looks like, and at f5.6, this is probably about as good as it's going to get, and I can use this frame as a reference to judge the other apertures as well. f8 is very similar, as is f11, and as I go up to the maximum aperture of f16, there is a little bit of softness creeping in at this point. So f11 seems to be the limit of maximum sharpness for this particular lens. Going in the other direction, f4 still looks good, but at f2.8 and something quite curious happens. The image is still pretty sharp, but the lines have gone from black to purple. Even with the automatic lens corrections in Lightroom, that purple's still there, and I didn't realize my lens was doing this before the test. I've never noticed it in any real-world pictures that I've taken. But we can go in and use the purple slider on the D fringe to convert that purple fringe back to black. So that was a good side benefit to this test, that I know that I need to make that correction for this lens. f1.4 still quite acceptable, and we do get a little drop off at f1.2, but it's not all that bad. And at f1.2, there's so little in focus in the image anyway that the razor thin depth of field is your limiting factor rather than the sharpness. If I go back and look at one of my portraits that I shot at f1.2 on this lens, even when I zoom in, the sharpness is completely acceptable. And who's going to be zooming in other than me? The picture at full size, completely acceptable. I also ran the same test looking at corner sharpness. Now, I don't particularly care about corner sharpness because in portraits, if I lose sharpness in the corners, that's actually a benefit. I want the sharpest thing in the portrait to be the face of the sitter. But if I was doing something that was more sharpness critical, like scanning film or taking pictures of flat artwork, corner sharpness would be really important. And even with this lens, corner sharpness is still fine between f2.8 and f11, but there are other lenses that have better corner sharpness characteristics, like 100mm macro, and that's the lens that I would turn to for that sort of work. This test will be different for every lens that you use. This aperture test is fantastic for knowing which apertures will have a sharpness that you're comfortable with and which apertures might be completely unusable. Those characteristics depend on your own opinions, your own use cases, and different lenses will suit different applications. That's why it's difficult to use one lens for everything.